Right now we're going to talk about the difference between a theory versus a law in a scientific context. Everyone probably has used these concepts or these terms in everyday speech. However, within the sciences, we have very specific definitions of what these mean. So we're going to briefly go over what these definitions are and how they relate to what we're talking about today. A law is a statement about a repeatable event. So some laws that you might be familiar with include the law of conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics, Hooke's law, Newton's law of universal gravitation. All of these are laws. A scientist has seen, or numerous scientists have seen, the same phenomena occur again and again. They're just describing that. Theory, on the other hand, is an explanation of a natural phenomenon based on extensive evidence. So looking at evidence there, you're explaining how something occurs. So some examples of theories include general relativity, quantum mechanics, and plate tectonics, including, of course, theory of evolution. So both are considered factual understandings of the natural world, but one cannot become the other. They exist independently of each other and serve different purposes. So, moving on from that, let's look at this history of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And that means that we're looking at this evolution in terms of this concept of descent by modification, changes occurring over time. So, Darwin said, there's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So he was explaining that organisms are continually adapting and changing to their environments. Darwin went around the world on the HMS Beagle. He was a naturalist, and he did this in 1831. And this voyage lasted for 5 years. And his job was actually to be the scientist on board and take observations as a naturalist. So he made observations on this trip, and as he was going around the world, he saw things he had never seen in England. Remember, people didn't have ways of looking at things from all over the world at that time. He was getting a unique view that no one or very few people had seen, and he was taking specific observations of what was going on in these places and taking all the information down into his notebooks so that he could try to make sense of why in the tropics are you seeing things that look nothing like you see in England? Why in Africa were they seeing things that were very different? And so through these journeys, he was able to see the world differently than he had ever seen before. It was not till 1859 that Darwin finally published his Origins of Species, and he knew that it would be troubling, and he actually really held off on doing it. He himself had troubles with some of it, but he was really feeling like he needed to get the information out because he had seen something that was so unique. So Darwin set sail in 1831, and what he realized was that organisms were not fixed and unchangeable. Before that time, the prevailing idea was that you would have an organism, and scientists of the time would do a collection, and you would all try to meet a type of that organism. So there would be a type in a museum, for instance, and that would be the correct type or the expected type, and you could be different from that type. And what he realized is that things had been changing all this time, and he used the fossil record and then all this biodiversity he had seen to realize this was going on. And he provided explanation of the process of evolutionary change through the theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, also realizing at this time that he did not understand genetics. There's no concept of this going on. And so the molecular mechanism of how DNA works or anything like that was not understood. He just could see that this process was going on. Darwin saw finches, and we looked at that in the Galapagos Islands, the islands that changed the world, when we watched that video. And he really was able to see that there were a few very strange things. One, the idea that there was only the finches, that was the only little bird that existed, and instead of all being identical like he had expected, like a finch looks like this, they all had unique morphotypes or shape types where, depending on their niche, their beaks were very different. And this idea of radiation, or having one common ancestor go into many different types of niches, really got his head thinking about how this actually took place. So seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. And so that is how Darwin interpreted it. Here's how this looks as far as this radiation of finches. You have the ancestor there at the center, and then you have the different niches or locations or types of habitat and ecological roles the different finches play. So you have some in trees, some in cacti, and some on the ground. And already we start to see a divergence just of birds that are related, but how they fall into different categories. But then we have seed eaters, okay? And the seed eaters all are finches. But then within these finches, we end up with finches that have all sorts of different adaptations depending on the types of seeds that they eat. So that gives kind of an idea of how he was able to look at this and break this down. So Darwin had 4 premises. 1, each species produces more offspring than will survive to maturity. And that's a key. So if you have only one that survives, then, or you have none that survive, then this premise would not work. But we know, we talked about R and K strategists earlier in the year, so we know that this definitely does take place. Individuals in a population exhibit variation. So if everything is identical, and we talked about being potatoes, if everything's identical, you put a selection pressure on it, everything dies. So that no longer does this become something we can think about. 3, there are limits on population growth imposed by the environment. So that's that selection pressure that we talked about the other day. Something imposes a selection pressure and makes some organisms have favorable existence to others. And there's differential reproductive success among individuals with that population. So having this characteristic means that somehow your offspring are going to be more numerous. So he was actually living in a time where there were also other ideas about how to think about the world's population and about how humans came to exist, how other organisms came to exist. And one important influential person was Thomas Malthus, 1798. And what Malthus offered is if human population continued to grow, resources would run out. And he was quite convinced of this. Malthus just saw the population of humans increasing and thought, hey, we can't keep going at this rate. And how did Darwin use this? Well, he applied this to the struggle for resources of plants and animals. And this same concept of, well, there's a limit to the amount that populations can have based on the resources available. So he took that concept and incorporated it into one of his 4 premises. And so he says an oyster produces millions of eggs in 1 year. A maple tree produces thousands of seeds in a single summer, but they don't all grow to live. Why do some live and some die? And that type of selection pressure is what he came to realize. You got this giant population, but with limited resources, only some of them survive. Another influential person was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1809. He was a French naturalist. Now, Lamarck actually had some pretty remarkable thinking, and at the time now that everyone understands the process of natural selection, folks were like, oh, Lamarckian is seen as something kind of not as good. But however, at the time, he really obviously thought of a mechanism or way by which change could occur over time in species. So species change through acquired characteristics. So the idea that something happens to you over your lifetime and that changes you through time. So, example, if you lift weights, your children will have big muscles. So this is incorrect, but it did explain adaptation, the concept that we have characteristics that help an organism adapt. And he often, the example that's used to really help understand what he meant by Lamarck's concepts was this, that if you have a rat or a mouse and you cut off the tail, that the babies should have no tail. And he did do experiments to this end to try to figure this out. And of course, all the babies did have tails, because doing that type of change over the lifetime did not affect the next generation. However, some of the things we've studied in epigenetics has brought back some Lamarckian concepts. Now, someone who concurrently came up with the exact same idea as Darwin and doesn't seem to get nearly the credit is Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace also, at the same time, took a trip around the world, and he is mentioned in the Galapagos film that we watched. And he lived at the same time, and he came up with this concept of natural selection. And his observations were largely in Indonesia and the archipelago of islands in Indonesia. And ultimately, he led to Darwin publishing On the Origin of Species, because he realized Wallace also had this same idea going. Another very important figure that in understanding evolutionary theories was Charles Lyell of 1833. Now, Lyell was a geologist, and by looking at the processes of what occurs today on Earth, with how different geological formations occur, he realized that the Earth was a lot older than had previously been believed. And that is the book that Darwin was reading, of course, as he was going around the world on the HMS Beagle. And he argued that the formation of the Earth took place through small changes over time. This is called gradualism. And as he watched rivers or erosion or things like that, he looked at the rate, and he saw that the rate was different than had previously been thought. So Darwin expanded this to species changing over time. James Hutton is another geologist, and he published a book about the layers of the rock formation of mountains, erosion, etc., that occur over millions of years. And he could no longer measure the history of the planet in terms of human lifetimes. And so that was a contribution by James Hutton, also a geologist, and really looking at rock formations. So what is evolution? It's descent with modification and changes in the genetic structure of a population. Just like our activity where we are a deer and we're looking at our allele and population, the populations change in the allele frequency, that's what this means by the genetic structure changing over time. So, mechanisms that cause this change in the genetic structure of a population cause evolutionary change. One, you get genetic mutations. And so, mutations that occur in the DNA. The second one is genetic drift. If you have a population that's isolated, it will accumulate different mutations because of where it is living and because of whichever founder or the original individuals that went to that location carry particular mutations that have been able to go from generation to generation. The next one is related. It's the founder effect, and it's a small initial reproductive population with limited genetic diversity. And finally, the last one is natural selection, and that's you have different reproductive potential for organisms with different characteristics. Speciation means that you have intercontinental migrations of members of the camel family, for instance. Camels originate in North America during the Eocene, but when there were land bridges between Asia and North America, the migration occurred through those land bridges. Now there's an ecological barrier. Now that you no longer have this migration, the camel of North America has died out, but there are ancestors in South America and other species, and now they're isolated, so they no longer could come back and mate, because in their isolated areas they have become adapted to their own niches and have different genetic populations in those locations. Here we can see adaptation to a gray fox versus an Arctic fox. Again, based on the niche, you have different populations that can grow in those areas. So here is some where we can see that land bridge and some things that occurred through some ice being present in earlier times. And natural selection is then this mechanism: different survival and reproduction among individuals of a population. And this is response to selection pressures. The relationship of evolution and selection pressures to environmental science. So you have biodiversity that arises through evolution, human disturbance changes selective pressures, and then you have conservation of individual species. So the process of evolution through natural selection is this: you have overproduction, so many individuals. You have resources with limited population growth. You have heritable variation of traits, so that has to be inherited from there has to be the genetics, and then you have different survival and reproduction of the different, depending on which traits you have acquired. So some selection pressures, some are abiotic, such as temperature, precipitation, pH, and acidity. Biotic ones can include predation, disease, or competition. So there's many different types of selective pressures. We used the example of the peppered moth earlier, and here is some gradualism. Extinction is a major issue with this, and